could have picked an American startup, sure. But so 10 years ago and even now, I still think Japan's the place to be for robotics. But Japan, not just the startup ecosystem, but the whole robotics industry is extremely serious. And I like that. When people claim that they understand something, I think that's actually just an emotion. Nobody understands anything. You start to feel like you develop a sort of feeling or intuition for math, right? And then I'll pose some tough problem, and they'll kind of struggle through it, and suddenly they're like, aha, I got it.
Yeah.
And it's completely wrong, their answer, right? And I'm like, you don't got anything, man. Like, it's just an emotion.
Yeah.
And I could explain the right answer to you, and you're just going to keep looking at that answer over and over again until you feel an emotion.
Do you think we might see, like, you know, the, let's say, universal income and like the fact that there's no more jobs and now nobody really has to do
That's
anything?
very interesting. Even if you don't care about like success in the traditional sense, if you do care about that, the only way to achieve that is to do something you really, really like. Because you're not going to be somebody who loves what they're doing if you don't also love it. Let me give you two examples of what we might be able to do with this. So there's something called colloidal robots.
Welcome to the InnoHyve Podcast. In today's episode, we sit down with Russ Islam. Not only is he a successful serial entrepreneur, he is diving deep into research on soft matter and quantum control. Russ is exploring the frontiers of human knowledge. As always, links to learn more about our guests are in the description below. Russ discusses entrepreneurship, colloidal robots, liquid crystals, and soft matter. What's truly incredible about him is that he takes the time to explain these topics in a way that everyone can actually understand. If you'd like to support us, please like, subscribe, and share this episode. Enjoy this episode, and please don't forget to stay curious. Russ, thank you for joining us today. Pleasure.
Good to be here, man.
Yeah,
Thanks for inviting me.
Pleasure. Like, we had 30-minute chat online a bit, figured out what you're doing and what you're interested in, and from there I guess we decided to have this chat.
Talked about some deep stuff in the 20-30 minutes. So
like you shared several of those topics. With Wannes we did some research as well, so we're pretty excited. I guess we'll talk a bit about your background, your startup background, like what you're doing now, what you plan on doing, some more philosophical stuff as well. Before we get into it, I guess who is Russ? How would the people that you care about describe Russ?
Sure. So I grew up in the U.S. In Northern California, and I went to school at Stanford. And being in Silicon Valley, you're just kind of surrounded by all these tech companies, all these people that are trying to pull you in that direction. But I was always interested in science and engineering, that sort of stuff, growing up. But interested in other stuff too, not just super into tech. But you got to make a decision, so I got kind of pulled into science and engineering direction. But again, especially being in the SF area, and Stanford's a really good school for computer science, electrical engineering. So I went down that rabbit hole. But growing up where I grew up, there's a whole bunch of Japanese people there, right, in Northern California. So actually, in high school, I was taking Japanese classes there. So in California, it's usually Spanish that everybody takes. But Japanese was a really popular class in my high school. And it was just a public high school, not like a fancy private school or anything. But that class was full. And I took it for 4 years, right? So I didn't learn that much, but, got exposed to it. And then I decided to stick with it throughout college and studied abroad in Japan. And I didn't think I would live here, but I thought, I got to check it out. But when I came here, I was like, man, something just fits about this place.
Sounds familiar,
Yeah, and then basically right after I finished my master's in the U.S., then I just moved here, and I've been here since. So I've been here, 9-10 years. So it's awesome. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. And like I say, how will the people that you care about describe it? Like, who is Russ to them? Like,
Sure. Well, I really love like getting deep into tiny topics, sometimes obscure topics, but I like that kind of balance between practical things and theoretical things, right? So we'll get into what I do later, but I like to build things, but I don't like to not think about the bigger abstract picture.
Right.
So these days I'm really getting into deep mathematics and physics and that kind of stuff. So in that sense, I guess people would describe me as curious, right? That's if I got to pick one word, that's probably the
Nice.
best.
Curious. Yeah, and I think that's why we brought you in here, like
Sure.
just to go deep. But like, so you mentioned you had to choose for an engineering
Yeah.
path, and electrical engineering is what you chose.
Hmm.
Why electrical engineering? Why not software?
Sure.
Especially like coming, from
Sure.
Silicon Valley and everything. Why not? Like,
Yeah. So this is gonna sound like a really stupid reason, but it's the truth. So especially in high school, I got really into biology, and I thought I was gonna be a biologist, right? And I did all these like biology competitions and all this stuff. And there's this competition called International Biology Olympiad, right? So a lot of countries have it, including Japan, the U.S. Um, but basically, it's a big series of tests, right? And considering that when I got into high school, I barely knew any biology. After a couple of years, I knew quite a bit
mm,
for a high schooler, and I did really well in this competition, right? But uh, long story short, I got close to like the few people that get chosen to represent the U.S. I didn't quite make it, but I spent a whole another year. This is my senior year of high school, right? And it's a big commitment. Like I gotta cancel all these social events and uh, not spend time with friends just so I can sit there and study, right? And a whole year passed, and I still didn't make it to the international thing. I got exactly where I was the previous year, which is still good.
right.
It's like top 10 or something in the U.S., but I didn't make it to the very end, right? And look, man, there's been tough times in my life in other areas,
Mm,
and if I mentioned those, you'd be like, "Oh, those are really pretty tough." But this biology thing, to me,
yeah.
it was like I've never been so sad.
So you doubled down in effort and still got the same results,
Yeah,
basically.
that
It's
was what
just
it was, and
yeah,
that really, this is kind of cliche, but that
yeah,
teaches you it's not about the actual absolute number you get; it's about how much progress you made.
yeah.
And in my mind, I spent a whole year, sacrificed all these friendships and all this stuff to
Why did you
just
care so much to
I,
be
I don't
chosen
know.
for it? Like,
Yeah, I still don't really know, but I just got obsessed with that, and
yeah.
it's like this is me.
Is like
Yeah,
competitive nature of like trying to beat the other guy, or just
yeah.
beating yourself and getting more like
It's
which one is it?
it was
What's it?
beating myself.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, and it just felt like it didn't make progress. So
yeah.
the point of that story is, I was like, I'm just gonna give up biology right now. Just forget about it. So this is where the story gets dumb. So basically, in American universities, you don't have to choose your major until quite a bit after you enter. So that summer, right, I had failed this biology thing, and I was like just kind of depressed, and I was like, just play video games, right? I was playing Final Fantasy 13, all right, and in this game, I don't know if you played it, but it's in the future, and there's all these electronic parts that are just sitting
Mm,
around the world. You gotta pick them up and build them together, and I was like, that's it. I'm gonna do electrical engineering. So
nice.
it's not completely random because, of course, I had some interest in math and physics and
Right.
whatever. But I was like, whatever, I'm not gonna do biology. I crossed that off. But I got to pick something technical because
Mm,
that's what I like. Um, and just on a whim, I was like, whatever. And that sounds dumb, but when I actually started the major, entered school and all that, I realized, wow, this is actually a really great
mm,
subject, and it didn't have to turn out that way. It could have been a horrible mistake,
yeah.
but I got very lucky, and I went down that rabbit hole, and it was great. I still use those concepts today.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned control theory as well.
Yes, yes,
Tell us what is control
sure,
theory?
sure. So when people hear about electrical engineering, they think electronics and circuits. So of course, when I was studying that, I did have to take some of those classes,
Mm,
but that's not what I ended up doing. So electrical engineering is actually a really broad field. Circuits are part of it, computer architecture, sure, but a big part of it is something called signal processing, right? So it's kind of more abstract. So basically, we got these cameras, these mics, and you could open up some editing software to mix and master or put effects on it, right? So in that abstract sense, you got electrical signals coming from this microphone or from the camera. You're processing it. That's
mm,
signal processing, right? So it's very closely related to electronics, but it's broader than that.
yeah.
So it could be a signal from finance, right? That's a noisy signal that's going up and down. You can apply the same techniques to that. So control theory is related to that. So basically, imagine that you're controlling a car or an airplane or a rocket, and the position or the velocity of that system
Mm.
is again a signal in time, right? But now it's not just about filtering the signal or applying some editing to it. It's about how can I analyze the signal, even though it's noisy, and get the rocket to do what I want it to do, right? How
Mm.
can I get it from point A to B in the minimum amount of time, right? So in a very abstracted away sense, you're applying math techniques to some system.
Mm.
It could be anything. It could be electronics, which is where it started, but it could be, again, space systems. It could be finance, whatever.
Yeah.
And how do I steer it in a certain way?
Yeah. Trying to not lose any energy, kind of
But
like.
yeah, minimizing
Just
energy,
whenever.
minimizing time, minimizing risk if it's finance, for
Yeah.
example.
Got you.
Yeah.
Why are you so interested in that? Like,
Yeah.
which
Sure.
aspect do you feel so interested about?
Sure. So I've obviously been very influenced by that thinking, but I think that control theory can be applied to almost any technical field, right? So I'll give you an example. So we got some water here, and we all know that if light hits the water, it's gonna bend and go in a slightly different angle, right? So you can put your hand underwater and it looks bent, and that's actually the shortest path that light takes between those 2 points, right? So it's actually faster for it to bend at the interface than to go in a perfectly straight line, right? So you can derive that from physics or just do experiments, right? But also you can cast that as a mathematical problem, right? If I have a string between these 2 points, I can bend the string in different directions and measure how much time it takes me to cross, right? So, to get to the point here, basically, light will travel in a certain speed in the air
Mm.
versus the water, right? And it's not so straightforward how those two things add up. But it turns out that a bent line is going to give you the shortest path. Now, you don't need to know anything about physics to answer that. You can cast that as a
Observe.
purely mathematical problem, right? Just by changing the string around, right? So uh, I had this professor who was teaching control theory, and professors, they love to just talk down about other fields, like, oh, the chemists are like, oh, biologists, they're just applying chemistry, so whatever,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So it's funny because this guy who studies control theory, he's like, all the physics is just a small application of control theory, right? Definitely not true, big overstatement. But that's a useful way of thinking about things because,
Mm.
when you're moving a certain object from point A to point B, physicists, they think in terms of laws that you're applying, right? Gravity, electricity, whatever. But you can also think about that as a control theory problem, right? The forces are going to make this particle, this ball or whatever, go from A to B in a certain path that can be described by these forces and the
Mm.
shortest time it takes to get from there to there, right? So that gets a little bit into the research that I'm doing now, which is related to soft materials, liquid crystals, right? And people are starting to apply control theory to these materials to get them to do potentially useful tasks.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, like I mean, I'm surrounded by a bunch of robotics engineers and stuff, so I guess like that's how I kind of figured a little bit more about it as well. But
Uh-huh.
like you mentioned as well, like you decided to study Japanese. Like I mean, I've been here for 5, 6 years, and never in my mind will studying Japanese sound like a hobby. Like why did you feel like attracted by Japanese in general, and like what did you like about it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I just like hard things.
Yeah.
I just like to do hard stuff just for no reason, right? That's why I like math and Japanese. For an English native speaker, that's considered the hardest language to learn, right?
Yeah.
Some people might say Chinese, but from the people I've heard who speak both languages, they actually say it's Japanese because you got all these different alphabets together, right? And they're kind of randomly arranged in some ways. Right? There's a lot of historical baggage, right? And the grammar is just so different from English. Uh, but at the end of the day, again, uh, some people might think this is kind of a shallow reason, but I really just like the sound of the language, right?
Mm.
That's above all, that's what draws me to it. I can talk about other reasons why Japan specifically, right? Because for robotics and electronics and material science, Japan's a great place.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I'm here because I just love the language.
Interesting. Yeah, especially you choose to go for electrical engineering. I mean, back then, I mean, Japan was still probably
Yeah,
at its peak, and so yeah, we'll have probably thought more about those reasons.
sure.
Um, but so basically, then you come to Japan. And I want to talk a little bit about your career and
Mm.
the startups you worked in. Then we go a little bit more into what you're doing now. But like, I think the first company you worked for was a Mujin, right?
Yep.
Like, for someone with your degree coming to Japan, the easy path is probably then going for gaishike, very high salary, like
Sure.
headquarter, getting paid in US dollars and stuff. And like, but you choose to go for Mujin, which at the time was very small. Why?
Yeah.
Why choosing Mujin?
Yeah. I guess I was just influenced by startups. So uh, in Silicon Valley, everybody, well, 80% of people are going to go work at Google or Apple or
Yeah,
something like
exactly.
that. And that's a default path for me. And even if I decided to move to Japan anyway, I, like you said, would have worked at Google Japan or something like that, right? But I knew people who worked at those companies, and majority of my friends there not too happy, right? They got a nice cushy salary. They get to go home at 6 p.m., right? But they're fixing Gmail bugs all day, right?
Right.
You're great, sure, but most of them were not
No
super
building.
enthused about it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And time is limited. Don't know when you're gonna die, so I want to work at a place that's building something new, right? And I could have picked an American startup, sure, but uh, so 10 years ago and even now, I still think Japan's the place to be for robotics, right? Uh, there are many flashy U.S. startups. Some of them are doing good things, but Japan, not just the startup ecosystem, but the whole robotics industry, is extremely serious. I like that. And Mujin is a very serious place. So the CTO, founder of Mujin, is an American guy. Um, he's pretty famous in the robotics community itself. So I had heard of him before joining Mujin. Um, but he's a big name in motion planning for
Mm.
robotics. And then out of the technology that he made during graduate school, he made Mujin. And yeah, he's like, Japan's a place to start this kind of company like Mujin because the factories here, they're very serious about adopting robotics technology. They have a whole lot of experience, and sure, they might not be as strong when it comes to
Mm.
software, but that's not really the bottleneck in Japan. So, but Mujin provides that sort of software, right? Motion planning, control software, vision software,
Mm.
and the Japanese factories, they really care about precision, of course, and quality, and that's exactly what you want if you're trying to sell uh, this very complicated robotic software, right? Because in the US, for example, and I'm kind of generalizing here, but if you can make some flashy demo that works 90% of the time, 95% of the time, that's pretty good, right?
Yeah.
Now, that mentality, I think, comes from apps. And,
Mm.
apps are important. I'm not trying to talk down about that. But when it comes to manufacturing,
Yeah.
if you have a 10% failure rate,
It's very
or even,
expensive.
yeah, 1%,
Yeah.
Amazon in their warehouses, they're moving boxes, a million times per day,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's 10,000, 100,000 failures every day. That's insane. You can't
Yeah.
accept
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So you need like a 1 in 100,000 failure rate or less, right? And when it fails, it's got to fail predictably, right?
Yeah.
And the amazing thing about Mujin is that they've really dug deep into the physics and the mechanical engineering of everything.
Yeah.
Uh, so they don't rely too much on AI or deep learning and that kind of stuff, right? And for good reason, because if I'm running $100 million factory, right? I don't care so much about getting a robot that can do everything,
Mm.
but it fails 1% of the time, right? I, I want something that fails predictably. So maybe something fails a little bit more than that for, I give it some random input. I give it some weird object that I can't pick up, right? But if you can tell me exactly what type of object it's going to fail for,
Yeah.
then I can just
It's taken
not
out of
put,
the
yeah,
process.
it's a factory. It's not the
Yeah.
natural environment.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so really you want predictability, and that's what Mujin
Yeah.
offer.
Yeah. You can adapt the factory wi- uh, against the
Exactly.
robot, I guess. What was your role at Mujin?
I was a computer vision engineer,
Okay.
right? And I worked at, in kind of a researchy sort of role, which was perfect for me. So
Mm.
I would read hundreds of papers, implement them, and make algorithms that would basically uh, calibrate the robot, right? So I did a few different things, but one of the biggest things I did there was, so you got a camera or several cameras and a robotic
Mm.
arm, and the controller the computer that's actually generating commands to move the robot, is doing everything in simulation, right? So you take pictures, you make maybe 3D scans
Yeah.
of the environment, you put those in the computer, and you pray that they're accurate, right? They may not be, but you pray that they're
Mm,
accurate, and then blindly the computer is calculating what to do, right? Just in this kind of VR sort of environment. Then it tells the robot what to do, and it sees if it messed up or not, right?
right.
So if the camera and the robot are not aligned very precisely, everything is off,
Yeah,
right?
makes sense.
So, for example, if the camera angle is off by a fraction of a degree, everything's tilted this way, the robot's gonna destroy something, right?
Yeah.
And you can't just manually do this, right? Like the human hand precision, the eye precision is just not anywhere near what a robot
Yeah.
can do. So you got to do this mathematically, right? So I'll give an example. So as a child, right, we learn to pick up things like this cup, and what happens is we just reach for it, probably knock it over, break it, right, and we learn,
Yeah.
and we get better, and we use a lot of our sensations in our hands to learn what's happening. Robot has none of that, right?
Mm,
It just has this hand that has no sensors on it
yeah.
and just this eye, right? So there must be some mathematical function that describes, hey, if I look at this thing, I should be able to convert it to the position of my finger and pick it up, right? So the algorithm, roughly speaking, that we use is you give it some well-known object or some pattern.
Yeah.
Take a bunch of pictures, and then now you perfectly know exactly the position of the camera, the angle, the way the hand moves, right? Now you can pick up really precise things like tiny screws and tiny bolts, right?
Yeah.
That's the idea.
Yeah, I remember trying to working with Mujin a little bit on exactly that
Sure.
position. And every time I was looking for computer vision people, they were way
Yeah.
more like, I guess, on people who using like Python libraries and for image
Sure.
recognition, but not the mathematical background.
Right.
And hence I gave up on the position.
Probably,
Yeah.
I don't know for sure, but I think that might have been the spot that I left.
Yeah, that was like 2020-ish.
That's when I left. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I started recruitment pretty much at that time, I think.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, it was, yeah, I didn't really try hard. It
Yeah.
was super hard to find people. And
Yeah.
I just remember this whole thing. It was like, we don't do traditional, they were calling it, we don't do the same computer vision as other companies.
Yeah.
For us, it's very all about, it seems like they
Yeah.
did the right choice because now I think they're
Sure.
the leader here in Japan as well.
Exactly.
That's good.
Yeah, that's computational geometry, and you need to know a lot of linear algebra and mathematical optimization, all this stuff, right?
Yeah.
And there are people that are trying to apply deep learning to this,
Yeah.
but there's clearly an answer to this problem, right? It's a physical problem. There's no guesswork involved, really.
Mm,
So if you just know the math,
yeah.
there you go. The answer's done. Right?
Yeah, I guess through deep learning, then it's like more simulation, I guess. You just
Right.
run scenarios, and at some point you start
Right.
realizing which one works. And but for you, it's like, but it's hard to find people who want to
Sure.
solve the problem that you solved in that
Sure.
sense. So they basically, I
Mhm.
guess you had a good impact on Mujin because they kept that road. From Mujin, you started your own startup, correct?
Yes. I started two.
Okay.
So the first one, this seems super random, but it was actually a gaming company. So it was this online game that we would sell to companies. So this was right at the peak of COVID, right?
Okay.
So I had a couple friends in the U.S. and Canada that's they're good friends of mine, and they wanted to start this remote company. And one of those friends did this basically in person. That was one of his consulting businesses. So he was an expert in organizational structure. So
Okay.
he would go to these different companies, and basically there's this way to interact with people or play a sort of game with them that builds the company culture, right? So it
Okay.
sounds kind of fuzzy, right? But there's real value there, and especially during COVID when everybody was at home and you don't have this
Yeah.
water cooler anymore, we were trying to create this basically virtual water cooler. And Zoom doesn't work because you just feel like you're being watched, and it's just meetings, and you just see somebody else's head on the screen all the time. So the idea was,
Mm,
okay, we make it video based, but we keep it very small on the side, and in the middle there's a game that you play basically,
interesting.
and we would make it in a way so that uh, HR could have access to it or might not have access to it. It depends on the manager, right? So you might create a space where people will meet on like a Friday night, and
Yeah.
only that team has
Interesting.
access to it,
Yeah.
and you have it's a really simple game that anybody could play, right? Some kind of prompt based game or 2D game, right? so that you can kind of gossip, basically,
Yeah,
during the
yeah.
game, right?
Yeah, it's like the nomikai with or without the manager kind of thing,
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
And then for the version that the HR team could use, it could be a way to onboard people, right? So it's kind of less confrontational. So
Right.
instead of going through a big list of, hey, these are the rules of the company or the culture, whatever. Hey, let's play this game where you sort of ask questions or you interact with other people who you're going to be working with.
Yeah.
So you get to know them, and it's not just this really stiff interview, right?
Interesting. Yeah.
So that didn't really pan out. So that company's still around, and we're making a little bit of revenue, right? But it's sort of a lifestyle business now. It's not going to be this massive
Yeah.
company. I wanted it to become that way, and I
Mm.
worked on it for about a year. And the game's out; people can play it.
Well,
Yeah,
what stopped the company from being such a success that you
yeah.
managed?
I think it was just a difference of. Uh, so there's three founders, including me. A difference of the way we wanted to take the company, right? So, for example, one of the co-founders actually introduced me to my next partner, co-founder, to start the other company, right? So that founder is like my best friend, so he was very nice about it. But he's like, look, this it's clear that this is not going to become what we want it to become. This is a great opportunity for you. You should go and pursue that. It's more hardware based, right? I was like,
Mm.
all right, if that's fine with you guys, I'll go ahead and do that. I'll get there in a second. Um, but I was working on this full time, and the other two co-founders, no fault of their own, but they were working on this part time, and
Oh, okay.
I wanted them to drop everything and do this full time, right? And because that's what I did. This
Yeah.
is all I was working at the time, and we'd all had invested our own money into this, etc. Right? All bootstrapped, right? So it didn't really get to the place where it would become VC funded, right?
Yeah.
That was the idea at first, but people we all kind of went off in our different directions. So yeah,
Gotcha. But did the product, because uh, like I'm not sure how easy it is for a company
mhm,
to adapt this kind of technology, for example,
sure.
like because the onboarding thing should still kind of be a little bit serious, I guess.
Mhm.
And how are companies reacting to the pitch in general? I'm actually curious
Yeah,
because I'm working for
yeah,
in recruitment stuff, and yeah.
yeah. Actually, I still think it's a really good idea. We
Yeah.
just didn't execute on it because we spend zero on marketing, right?
Okay.
And yet to this day, people are just finding it on the internet and
Yeah.
signing up and paying for subscriptions, right? But yeah, we just didn't really capitalize on it. But we had several companies that we would sell to,
Yeah.
right? And they would pay pretty good money for it. And for the most part, everyone's quite happy with it, right?
Mm.
Um, and despite how simple the game was, people would keep playing it and coming back to it. And yeah, it really is. I
Are
think
there other companies out there doing something similar now?
kinda, but not quite the way that we did it. So I think really focusing on 2D games could be the kind of untapped part of
Yeah.
the market, right?
Interesting.
I got more interested in hardware stuff. That's my background, so I'm kind of veering back
Makes
into that.
sense. Yeah.
But there's a clear demand, I think,
Yeah,
for
no,
both.
it sounds interesting.
Yeah,
Like I can see how people will kind of enjoy it as well. And but so basically, then you were full time, they were not.
yeah,
Things kind of drift apart. Still generates a bit of revenue, so
yeah.
it works. But nobody really committed to the point of like.
Basically, that's what it was.
And then you moved to this hardware project, more
Yeah.
IoT related, I think. You
Yes.
mentioned.
Yes. A company called Monochrome. So,
Yeah.
yeah, like I said, one of my past co-founders introduced me to this other co-founder. Um, so yeah, it's a smart house company. So we started in 2021, and so I left basically at the end of last year. And at that time, the company had grown to about 40 people, so much more
Okay.
serious than the last company.
Oh yeah.
And it was VC funded and everything, right? And they're still doing well, right? So one of our engineers stepped up to become the CTO when I left, right? Um, and again, basically the reason I left was uh, we had spent all this time developing the technology, and it came to a pretty mature spot. I thought we had iterated many times, and we had deployed several houses throughout Japan already, right? Uh, so at that point, basically last year,
Mm.
uh, the real hardcore tech development it kind of slowed down. Not a bad thing, but the company's kind of going more in a direction where it's like, okay, we're going to focus on the app
Yeah.
and the user experience. Fantastic,
Yeah.
but I'm a hardcore tech guy.
You want to
I'm
build
gonna
many
go do the
things.
next thing, right?
Yeah.
Um, But yeah, it was great. We have a team of about a dozen engineers from all sorts of parts of the stack, right?
Yeah.
So we have electricians, we got electrical engineers, people really good with things like microcontrollers, Raspberry Pi, that sort of thing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, People who are experts on like air conditioners, but also people higher up on the stack, so they're doing app development, um, but also things with security cameras, image
Yeah,
processing, right?
yeah,
Just everything.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But for you, basically, once the core business is there, and all the rest is just add-ons, I guess,
Sure.
to just
Yeah.
make the customer happier, I guess.
Sure. Sure.
And that part, you're like, nah, kind of want
Right.
to build a new thing, and
Exactly. Yeah. For the
that's
first
interesting.
few years, again, control theory kind of has a thread through all this stuff
Yeah,
because the whole point of that system was to control in an optimal way
yeah, yeah,
the air
yeah.
conditioning, the lights, all that stuff, right? Solar panels, right?
That's interesting. So, two follow-up questions on this. Like, the first one is like, so those three star, I guess Mujin is a bit apart. You're probably still quite junior and more like an
Mm.
employee mindset
Yeah,
at
yeah,
that time.
yeah.
Then you go to the next one, or what will be like the main key lessons you took from startup to startup, or like
Sure.
that you will kind of utilize now for the next startup you want to probably build?
Yeah, there's a lot, but let me try to distill it.
Yeah.
So there's like a balance between immediately serving the customer and having some kind of vision.
Mm.
That's really hard to balance. So if you've got a company that's not super deep tech, right? You're making food delivery service, for example,
Yeah.
right? You can build it, right? There's no uh, unknown technological hurdle. That's not to say it's not hard to build an app, right? There's a
Yeah.
lot of stuff involved with like the server and networking and whatever, right? But you're not, building something that doesn't exist.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, so it does make sense to focus on short to medium term, right? And really pouring money into sales and time into sales, right? But if you're making a deep tech startup, Mujin, for example, they didn't really start picking up in sales until several years after they were founded, right? It's very research
So
heavy
burning
companies.
cash for a while and
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And of course, you want to grow the team at a sustainable rate, but yeah, basically you're burning cash for the first several years and relying on the goodwill of investors and saying, it's coming up, just wait, be patient, and you got to find the right type of investor for that because
mm,
some investors are not willing to sit through that, right? And maybe they're nervous or something,
that makes
but
sense. Yeah.
you got to find the right partner for that. But you have to make a decision like which kind of startup are you? Right? Are you going to be that kind of not so deep tech startup that's going to focus on, oh, I'm going to shoot to IPO in 4 or 5 years,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Versus I'm willing to stay here for 10 years, 20 years if it takes, right? And maybe we don't make so much money in the beginning,
Yeah.
but we're trying to make like $1 trillion, like
Yeah. That's disturbing the industry, kind of.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And you can disturb the industry with not deep tech if it's like a business innovation, right?
Yeah.
But you got to commit to which path you're on, right?
Mm,
Yeah,
makes sense. So that's for you like the main, I
that's
guess.
the big takeaway for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, deep tech sounds, I guess, very scary for pretty much anyone,
it
right?
is.
As an engineer, you commit to
Sure.
something that you don't know, like, because you said
Yeah.
yourself, right? Like, time is limited at some point.
Yeah,
Moving on, like as an engineer, you want to build a family, maybe you want more stability, and so
sure.
you can see how all those phases, not just from the investor perspective, it's like, man, you need result, right? You
Uh,
need to know that you're not wasting your
right, right.
time. So interesting. And the other question I have for you as well is
Mhm.
like, your definition of a successful startup. What is it? Because it seems that at least with the previous company you left last year, you're the kind of person who wants to constantly build new big things. So you might never really be there when things get really at scale and
Sure.
really qualified as successful startup. So what is a successful startup to you?
Yeah, I'm definitely a 0 to 1 person, right?
Mm,
So, or maybe I should phrase it this way. So let's say 100% is IPO or even past IPO.
yeah,
I really love 0 to 90%, right? Making something out of absolutely nothing, right? Going from 90 to 100 is really hard, really hard. I'm just not so interested in that part,
yeah,
right? Being honest. So, for example, when I was at Mujin, yeah, when I joined, it was 15 or 20 people, something like that. Uh, and they had been around for a few years already, so I wasn't like a super early employee or anything.
yeah,
But we're still building core technology.
yeah,
So, for example, that whole calibration with the camera and the robot. When I joined, they were doing it by hand, right? That's
Yeah.
how early it was. And by the time I left, you just press a button and it gets done, right?
Yeah.
Now it's basically take it for granted, right? Awesome, right?
Yeah.
But now they're really focusing on new applications, and they're doing just as much deep tech as before, but it's at a higher part of the application stack, right?
Yeah, makes sense.
So it's like I can see the finish line from here. Okay, time for me to go somewhere else, make a new race, right, and start there. So to answer your question, what makes a successful startup? Well, I don't want to take the narrow view of, look, you maximize shareholder value, period. That's it, right? I really don't think that's what it's about, because then that applies to any business in general, right? But if I'm going to compress my working life into a few years and ruin my sleep and all this stuff, it better be for not just about making money. That's important, of course, but making some useful product that wouldn't have been there otherwise, right? So not just making another smartphone, right?
Yeah.
But a completely different type of smartphone architecture, for example, right? That, if I or the company I was at didn't make that technology, it would have never existed, or it would have been 50 years until it existed, right?
Yeah.
So bringing that value to society or even to your own employees, right?
Yeah.
That is the other ingredient that's needed, not just making money.
Yeah.
Right.
I think that it comes down to that. You're saving a lot of people time, right?
Yeah.
Because eventually you probably get there, but like you accelerate things and you save a lot of people time and frustration. Like
Exactly.
that makes sense. And I guess that draws us to like what you're doing right now, right? Like what are you doing right now, Russ? What's the next
Sure.
step?
Yeah. So it seems like I made a really different leap recently, but to me it all seems like a straight line. So now I'm doing physics research, right? Theoretical physics on something called soft matter, right? So I'm going to start a PhD soon, and so this past year, basically after leaving the company, just full time, I've been informally doing this kind of physics research. So there's a whole lot of terms here, but we'll work through them one by one. But when you hear the word physics, you typically think of particles and quantum mechanics and colliders and that kind of stuff. That stuff is important, but there are many other areas of physics too. And actually, the biggest area of physics in terms of how many people are working on it is something called condensed matter, right? That sounds fancy, but it's very simple. So in school, we learned there's solid, liquid, gas, right? Condensed matter is just liquid and solid, right? It's condensed. That's it. So it's basically material science, right? But there's a whole rich structure inside of solids and liquids, right? Gases can be complicated, but they're relatively simple compared to liquids and solids, because gas particles are very far apart. They don't interact so much. It's simpler, right? So historically, people have studied gases to make, automobile engines, plane engines, whatever. So we know that technology pretty well at this point, but liquids and solids, we don't know so well. But in the past 100 years or so, especially after we learned about quantum mechanics, we started to understand solids a lot better, and that's why we have computer chips, right? We studied silicon,
Yeah.
studied metal, and that kind of stuff. So we have all these things now, but we still don't really understand liquids. Liquids are really tough, and you can even think about something in between liquids and solids, right? Something kind of squishy that has some properties like liquids, some properties like solids, right? And this is soft condensed matter, right? And it's a really popular area of physics these days. And I can give some examples of soft materials. So there are many things in everyday life, right? So basically all living things are made out of soft materials, right? Everyday household objects would be shaving cream, right? So it seems mundane, like shaving cream. So what? Why are physicists studying that? Shaving cream is insanely complicated, all right?
Okay.
So to give an example about solids, so like this cup here is solid. The mathematical way to describe this is, if I push it 5 centimeters, the other side moves 5 centimeters. Okay, so what? Of course, right? That, although it seems mundane, is actually kind of amazing. Because if you think about it from an information perspective, I pushed on this side, and everything got transmitted. All the force, all the information, if you want, got transmitted to the other side intact, right? Of course, if I really hit it hard, it's going to break. But to a certain extent, when I push in a certain way, that information gets transmitted without getting destroyed to the other side almost instantly, right? But if I have shaving cream, okay, if I just leave it on my hand, it just sits there. So it's kind of like a solid. But if I push it even a little bit, the force just obliterates the shaving cream, right? So I put in an input and I get a nonlinear output as opposed to that, right?
Right.
So the behavior cannot be described by simple equations, right? Another way to think about it is, even if I hit half of the shaving cream really hard, the other half is probably not going to be affected at all, right? So the information got lost somewhere inside the shaving cream, right? So you can see how this starts to raise questions about information loss and information storage. And, we'll get there, but this opens up some new ideas in terms of computation. Because all of our computation right now is solid state, right?
It's
Silicon.
binary 0 or 1s.
Exactly, right? And the predictable inputs and outputs, right?
Yeah.
But liquids and things called liquid crystals, they might open up a new door.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. Like, so when preparing for the podcast with Vanas, you told us about liquid crystals. We did look up a little bit what it was. Ended up looking at like LCD screens and smartphone screens and stuff. But like, explain to me, and for anyone, like, what are liquid crystals and why should we care as well? Because obviously, you see magic and things that most people don't, right? But like, why should people care in general about liquid crystals?
Right, well, it's my favorite topic, so
yeah,
I'm happy to get into this. So, all right, you've got a monitor here, and pretty sure this is a liquid crystal display. And we've heard about LCD, and it's in basically every screen you have, right? And yeah, there are like OLED screens and stuff these days, but for the most part, it's all LCD, right? So liquid crystals are really not anything that special, right? So I said there's 3 phases of matter: solid, liquid, gas, but that's a lie. You learn about that in school because it's simple, but there are many phases of matter, many. One of them is the liquid crystal phase, all right? Now, not all materials can form the liquid crystal phase. The molecules have to have a special structure, and it's simple. They have to be rod-like, right? So just imagine a few atoms arranged in a straight line, and if it is roughly shaped like a rod, they can usually form the liquid crystal phase, right? So let me spend a couple minutes on this. Right? So if we zoom in on a solid object like this cup, what we say when we say it's solid, if we really zoom in and we imagine we're the size of an atom, if we look around, we see order. And when I say order, I mean they're planes of atoms that are arranged in a periodic structure, right?
That's what makes it solid space.
That's what makes it solid, right? So there's 2 different types of order. There's order based on position and order based on orientation, right? So let me explain what that looks like in terms of atoms, and let me, after that, give you a simple analogy, right? So if I'm sitting in a crystal, like a solid, right? It could be this cup, it could be salt. There are these rows of atoms, and they're spaced regularly, right? In left and right, up, down, forward and back, right? And if I know the position of one atom, if I just add some constant, I can find the next one, right? So I won't see 2 atoms that are really close together or really far apart, right? I'm going to see them in regular intervals.
There's a pattern, basically.
Yeah, there's a pattern both in position, but also if I look in a different angle, I'm going to see another pattern, right? But if I go to liquid, it's just chaos, right? It's just random. So if I'm a little molecule swimming around in a liquid, there might be another molecule right next to me, and maybe not, right? If I pick another random spot, again, I might have a cluster, I might have nothing, right? It's just chaos. And they're also oriented randomly, right? So one molecule might be facing this way, one might be facing a completely different way. There's no pattern to it. But a liquid crystal is in between those 2 things. So it has orientational order, but it doesn't have positional order. What that means is, again, we have rod-like particles. They're all facing the same way, but their positions are all jumbled up, right? So if I'm a rod-like particle swimming around in a liquid crystal, there may or may not be a partner near me But if there is, they're going to be facing the same way I'm facing.
Yeah.
Okay. So here's an analogy. Imagine we're in a movie theater. Okay. So very regular seats and rows, right? And we're all facing the screen. Okay. So what phase of matter do you think that would be? Everything's ordered.
Same, like
Yeah. Positions are all ordered.
solid.
Yes, it would be solid, right? Regular in two ways. So the seats are all ordered, but you're also facing a certain direction. So imagine you walk into the theater and it's really dark. So if I walk around and I move my hands and I grab your head, right? Then I know just from that information that there's not going to be a head right next to your head. There's going to be a head maybe, 1 meter this way. And then I can keep going, right? So I get a little bit of information just by touching one part of the object.
Yeah.
Right? I can predict roughly how far things are going to go. But imagine now we're in an outdoor concert, okay? And there's no seats. You're just standing, and some people are clustered with their friends. Some people are alone, maybe. But everybody's facing the stage. That's a liquid crystal, right? Because there's orientational order. You're all facing a certain direction. But in terms of where people are standing, it's just chaos.
Yeah.
Right? So if I'm in a little zone of my friends, I cannot predict the
Why is
density
that? Why
of
is
the
that?
places.
Why is that exciting though? Like, because in
Yeah.
the end, like you say, it's all facing, but there's so much more freedom behind it. I guess is what you're saying.
Yes.
Why is that exciting? What are the I guess
Sure.
the benefits of that state then?
Sure. So based on the orientation of these rods, you can do a lot of interesting stuff, right? So the biggest application is, again, LCD, right? So the way this thing works is you got these two pieces of glass, and there's electrodes on them that you can't really see. They're really tiny. And in between, you have this 2D layer of liquid crystals. They're just floating there. But you are shining light from the back, and if the crystals are in a certain direction, they allow light to pass through. And if you twist them in the other direction, they don't let light pass through. And based on that angle, you're controlling each pixel, whether light goes through or doesn't go through, right? And, there's red, green, blue pixels, right? So you change each of those brightnesses, and now you get every color you want, right? So if it were a solid, you couldn't do that because, that thing doesn't move. But if it's a perfect liquid, it's also, you don't have that much control. But if it's a liquid crystal, there's some order which you can, on the fly, change based on electric fields.
Yeah.
And there you go.
So it's not on or off. Basically, you have like way more options.
Yeah. You.
I think I'm getting it, but like, this is deep. Like,
sure.
So what do you want to like personally accomplish with liquid crystals? Would you say, like, what are your ambitions? Because I mean, obviously we already have the LCD screen. Like, what are your thoughts that you can accomplish by, I guess, mastering the technologies? Like,
sure. So these liquid crystals we've known for a while. They're called passive liquid crystals, right? You make them in a lab, make them in a factory. But in the past 10 years, people have started to get a lot more interested in what's called active liquid crystals, right? And there's this whole field called active matter. It's closely related to soft matter. But active matter is just a type of matter where you apply some sort of energy. It could be something simple like you shine light on it, right? And it takes the energy and it turns it into movement, right? So this is a very broad category of materials, but cells are active matter, right? Plants, right? But we can think about inanimate active matter as well. So they're active liquid crystals, right? So if you shine light on them, they start to wiggle a little bit, right? And you can direct that into a certain type of motion, right? So what I'm interested in is how can we use this, exploit this to maybe do some kind of computation, right? Because clearly there's information stored in the direction of the field, right? So the direction of these rods, they can change from point to point. And the idea is based on that structure, you store a bit, for example, and you move those around, right? You apply some sort of light or electric fields, right?
Yeah.
And you compute things, right? If we can do this with the displays, right? In principle, it should be possible with active liquid crystals to do some kind of computation.
So you go like, this is like quantum level, so to speak, like you in terms of like possibilities of beating the current state of computing.
Yeah, so there's a lot going on here, but it's not quantum, right? And we can talk about quantum computing.
We will,
but it's not quantum. So it's actually still classical computing, right? And the reason is, if we talk about quantum computing, we're isolating one or a few atoms or electrons, and we're making it very cold around the atom so that it retains its quantum mechanical properties, right? But ordinary matter, we don't see those quantum effects for the most part because you got a whole bunch of atoms or electrons interacting with each other, right? So at the level at which I'm talking about liquid crystals, we don't really care too much about the quantum effects, right? So we're not using quantum effects in the screen, right? It's mostly classical physics, right? Um, and quantum mechanics is really important in physics, of course, but there are a lot of people studying classical stuff too, right? So when I say classical, I mean these things are at room temperature,
Yeah.
right? But that doesn't mean they're not complicated. They're insanely complicated, and in some sense, they're actually a lot more complicated than quantum stuff, right? Quantum stuff is unintuitive and freaky, but the classical physics stuff, the mathematics is just insane. Like it's unsolvable, as far as we know, right? But this would be a way to do computation that's in some ways like a classical computer, right? Not too much like a quantum computer, but in any case, I might want to say this is sort of like a third way of computing,
Right.
right?
What kind of, because again, most of the things that you're explaining to me, because you're explaining well, I do understand. I will say probably 60% max of
Sure.
complexity. To be fair, probably not even at 60%. But
Let's get it to 100%.
like how does, what kind of, I guess, solution products can you imagine getting out of that third way of computing? Like what happens in our daily lives if at some point, because the way I look at this is like if everyone starts getting excited about the same things you're describing to me, and I'm getting excited with no technical background, with no physics background, but if everyone gets there, things are going fast in terms of improving our lives as laymen, so to speak.
Sure.
Like what do you imagine happens if we get to that kind of excitement and using that third way of computing that you just mentioned? What happens?
Sure, let me give you two examples of what we might be able to do with this. So there's something called colloidal robots,
Yeah.
right? So a colloid is just a tiny particle, right? And I'm not talking about an atom. It's much bigger than that. But a particle that's small enough that you typically can't see it with your naked eye. But if you get an ordinary microscope, light microscope, you'll probably be able to see it, right? So examples are milk. So it looks continuous, smooth. But if you zoom in, there's little fat droplets that are floating around, right? But they're small enough that they just move around randomly because of they're getting bumped by these other atoms in the liquid. But they're light enough that they don't settle down, right? So they're in perpetual motion, basically. And another example would be paint. Again, looks continuous, but there are tiny particles embedded in there. So colloidal robots are robots that would be that size, basically, right? They're microscopic, but they're light enough that they just kind of float around, right? So liquid crystals play a role here. So, for example, there's some research that was done a couple of years ago where these experimental physicists, they get this 2D plane of liquid crystals, and they stick this tiny piece of metal in there, and it's not a robot in the traditional sense, right? There aren't any electronics inside of it. It's literally just a hunk of metal. But on the outside, you've got this magnetic or electric field that's controlling this thing. So it's kind of it's not touching it, but kind of remotely moving it around, right? But remember that these liquid crystals, they have rods, and the orientation is different in different parts, right? So the setup is you have this chunk of metal, and it's shaped like a plus sign, let's say, right? And you've got these little colloid particles. So in the experiment, they used silica. So it's, you got these silica packets like gel that you have in food to preserve it. It's exactly those things.
Okay.
So these little balls, right? You stick them in the liquid crystal. And you got these little pieces of metal that we call robots, but again, there's nothing inside of them. But liquid crystals, when they're on some surface, they like to stand perpendicular to the surface, right? So they made this plus-shaped robot so that the liquid crystal lines up around it, and you can tell how, based on the way it's lined up, it's creating this distortion in the field, right? That distortion is the key to controlling everything, right? So we use this magnetic field to move the little piece of metal around, and that creates this big distortion that gets propagated throughout the rest of the field. And you got these little silica particles over here, and that distortion controls the flow of the whole fluid. So you rotate the little robot, it creates this ripple that drags the little particle to the other side, for example. And they can control this so precisely that they can bring a few particles from here and stack them to make a shape arbitrarily, right? And again, I just want to emphasize these things are tiny, right?
Yeah.
If you try to use a little instrument to pick them up, you just like ruin everything, right? Maybe you could stack one, but then when you move the other one, because you're dragging it through the fluid, this guy flies off, right? So this little piece of metal, they're able to arbitrarily stack complicated shapes and not disturb it, right? So that's one kind of immediate example. And you can imagine how you could use that to make more complicated displays, or even just to transport tiny particles, right? Imagine a tiny little device that's doing something related to medical applications, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of an immediate application. But let me give you a super far out, just 50 years from now application, which is people have started to find out that if you look at certain living organisms, the orientation of those rods determines how it grows, right? So liquid crystals are found in many places, not just TVs, but inside of you, right? So you're made of cells, and those cells are made of membranes. Those are liquid crystals, right? So remember how I said the shaving cream, it acts like a solid in some ways, right? In terms of gravity, if I leave it there, it just stays there like a solid. But if I apply a force, it just, gives up.
Yeah.
If I have a cell membrane, those particles can be modeled as rods. So if I push towards the membrane, perpendicular, it acts sort of like a solid, right? If I poke it, it doesn't collapse. But if I'm in the plane of the membrane, right, if I'm swimming there and I look to my neighbors, you're floating around like a liquid, right? So the rods are constantly changing positions, but they're all oriented the same way, liquid crystal, right? So that's one place you see liquid crystals. But a really interesting place that people have found liquid crystals is hydra. So it's this sponge-like animal, right? And it kind of grows like a tree, sort of. And on the surface of this hydra, there are liquid crystals, right? And people have found that there's these things called defects, right? So the rods, they're all oriented a certain way, but you can imagine that at some point they have to change direction, right? And if you have many different rods aligning like this, then in the center, you get this singularity, right? There's a unique direction, right? So just imagine like a clock, right? The hands, you can imagine those as rods, but in the center, there's no unique direction, right? Turns out that those points are places where you have extra cell growth or less cell growth. Based on that, the hydra is able to grow an arm or not grow an arm, right? So, of course, deep down, the DNA has some sort of information that's telling the hydra how it's going to grow. But nobody knows right now how that information gets to the actual morphology of the animal.
Yeah. That's just new matter coming and
Yeah, so the idea is, for example, when you're just an embryo, you're just a single cell. You start dividing, and now you're 2 cells, 16 cells, 32, right? But you're just a ball. At a certain point, though, some cells die, some cells grow in a certain direction. You get an arm or a tail, gills, whatever, right? How do those cells know that?
Yeah.
Right? How does this cell know that it needs to die versus this cell realizing that it needs to divide more?
Yeah.
But people have started to found possibly liquid crystals convey that information to all the cells.
Will it be the same, like, for example, even the human body, in the sense that, like, I don't know, my fingers know when to stop growing, or
Exactly.
like there's
Right.
like,
Yeah.
hair or whatever, like at some point knows when to stop and knows how to start, like
Uh-huh.
and that's how you will basically use that, like, computational power and like to
Yeah. So to get into that, this is a crazy idea, but I think one day it could happen. So plants, for example, are just amazing because you just plant it in any direction you want, and it knows to fight gravity and go the other direction. So some people, they'll put a plant on a plate and they'll spin it really slowly, and the plant will grow in a spiral, right? And you could plant it sideways, for example, and it's gonna learn to grow this way, right? We've all seen this. So somehow, somewhere in the DNA, it's telling the plant something about its environment, right? and somehow from the DNA to the outside of the plant, it's figuring out how to bend. Again, nobody really knows how this works, right? But maybe liquid crystals provide some sort of in-between mechanism to convey that information to the other cells. That's kind of the thought process right now. So if you think about it, it's amazing because plants have this blueprint for what they're going to build. Okay, so they spend all this time on smart houses, right? And building a house is not easy, right? Even just a dumb house, right? There's all these problems. It takes months, right? But what if you could just plant a house?
Yeah.
Right? So you create some cells that have some blueprint for that, what the house is going to be like. And think about, a lot of houses, especially in Japan, they're made of wood. Okay, so you just grow them on the perimeter, and you've engineered some blueprint into them, and you just give them some sunshine, and it doesn't matter if it's windy or rainy or whatever. The thing just grows up straight, and it finishes, right? I mean, that's what your body does, right? Your body knows that, it creates this hand, and then it kills these specific cells so you don't get webbed fingers, for example.
Yeah.
How does it know that?
How This is crazy stuff.
Yeah.
Wait, but how do you get to a point where you don't feel also like so now you're researching all those things, and again, this sounds like an amazing world where, like you say, you plant your home, but how do you how do you find materials, for example, to learn about those things? How do you
Yeah.
how do you get there? Because I feel like, okay, this sounds like, okay, that idea of because I'm trying to grab things that, again, the layman can get excited about, like
Sure.
growing a house. That sounds amazing,
Sure.
right? Like this whole thing where it's like, okay, we know how to code the whole DNA and really have something growing on its own. How do we get there? Because I feel like you must feel very lonely sometimes in this kind of stuff. Like, who are there a lot of people researching all these things? Or where are we right now? And
Yeah, that's a great question because that sort of information access, it's really segmented and fragmented right now. So
yeah, I can imagine.
so for example, some of the most crazy things I read are deep in textbooks, just buried in there, and you would never know that unless you spend years studying it, right?
Yeah.
So just a simple example, but people are exposed to thermodynamics in school sometimes, and it's just the most dry subject, right? You learn about steam engines and whatever, because historically that's where it started, and it's a little bit simpler to analyze than what people study today. But for example, using ideas from thermodynamics, you can predict the density of the atmosphere or how water climbs up trees, right? They're all particles, so physics that studies particles should be able to explain these things as well, and they can, but it's not going to be until page 500 of some thick textbook, right? So one problem is that this information is just buried in these places, and another one is, these specific applications I'm bringing up, they're also buried in papers, right? And of course, you got to be very careful when we talk about science. I'm being kind of fast and loose with the way I'm saying things because, of course, I want to get people excited. But if you read these actual papers where people are talking about these things, it's really not clear sometimes what the implications are of this research. So the example with the colloidal robot, if I showed you that paper, it's just very dense, and they give you a few pictures, and they don't really explain too much the implications of what's going on. Because if they get too excited almost about it, the other scientists are like, what's with this guy, right? So you got to be very kind of objective and calm about it, which I get it. I get it. But, nobody's going to hear about this colloidal robotics thing. Right? And that's just a shame because, you go into mechanical engineering, for example, and you spend all this time solving equations, which is important, right? But, when you're an actual mechanical engineer, you're not going to be doing that by hand, right? You should learn the fundamentals, sure. But the most important thing is to keep you interested in mechanical engineering so you don't quit and do something else, right?
Yeah, I feel like that's every time the path to greatness, success, or it's always that, right? Like making sure we don't quit and keep that kind of incentive to
Right.
keep going as well. Because even I'm looking at myself, and I'm someone who didn't really do well at school at all. Like, I dropped out first, I think at 17. Then my father forced me to go back into school.
Nice.
Then I tried high school, was complete failure as well, and I hated it. But somehow it took me a while then to realize, well, I'm actually a super curious person, but not the way things are taught traditionally, because usually I don't see an incentive
Mhm.
for me to learn. And I feel
Sure.
like even today, for example, like, when I told the one as well, "Oh, we're gonna have Russ coming over here, we're gonna talk about those topics," we're super excited, even though we're not
Mm.
actively working on those things. But I feel like the more people like are getting excited, the better it gets, because then suddenly people care
Yeah.
and you get support. Because obviously talking about it, it's all fun, but to get to the level that you are now to talk about it, you have to study a topic that most people don't really look
Sure.
into. So how do you kind of continue to feel incentivized and excited about it in general?
Yeah, I mean, there are periods in my life where I got really disinterested in math
Mm,
and science, right? So, growing up when I was really young, I was really into science, because I would just read just random stuff from books, and not, I was 6 or something, so I wasn't taking it seriously, obviously. But you just look at pictures, right? And then I would just copy stuff from books, right? And then I started to actually take science or be forced to take science in school, and I was like, I hate this stuff.
yeah.
I mean, calculating the density of whatever over and over again, plugging in numbers, right? It's just tedious and, it's like menial work in a way.
Mm,
And, in some ways, I was actually more interested in things like language or history because at least there's a story there,
yeah.
right? Um, so I really hated math. That was absolute, you know, worst subject. And I did okay in it, but I just couldn't stand it.
Mm,
Um, and that lasted actually throughout high school as well. So I still, I started liking science more in high school, a lot more. But one reason I picked biology was because of very little math involved, right? I stayed away from physics. I would have never thought I would have be doing physics research right now, right?
yeah.
And it has to do a lot with people, honestly, because okay, I had pretty good math teachers I thought in high school, but they didn't really convey the same excitement that some professors in college did for me,
Yeah.
right? And when I really started to learn applied math, that's when I started getting interested in really abstract math, right? So some people, they look at really abstract stuff immediately. They're like, "This is for me," right?
Yeah.
I wasn't one of those people, right? I do like to build things with my hands, right? Build electronics, robots, uh,
Yeah, exactly.
play with cells and whatever, right? But then I started to think, okay, I can spend all this time building this one robot, and somebody can come and just destroy it, right? Somebody can come and step on it, and it's gone, right? And all that effort is destroyed, right? But if I learn general concepts of physics, robotics, whatever, then sure, I can instantiate that in one specific product or something, right? But I'm learning something much broader than that, that is true for the whole universe,
Yeah.
right? And something just gets me excited about that, right? But it took some people to show me that for me to realize that and get interested in it.
Mm. So you want to do something that, I guess, feeds on its own. You like, because it's the same for even for me, the way I look at it when it comes to business and stuff. Like,
Mm.
a lot of times people are like, "Man, if you know how, if you guys are all over the place, you do so many things." But I'm like, yeah, but in the end, the main thing is for me to just grow as a person and
Mhm.
learn, right? And hopefully make a good living out of this. But putting all your efforts into one aspect that, like you say, if tomorrow something happens, completely gets destroyed, well, all that energy that I put into is gone, right? So I guess it's the same approach, like trying to
Sure.
build knowledge around more bigger aspects and make it useful to a bigger amount of people as well.
Yeah, and part of that is, if you're gonna build anything useful, you gotta take on that risk of this could just be all for nothing,
Yeah.
right? But time's gonna pass anyway.
If you have fun
So
doing it, like,
if you have fun doing it, yeah, for me, that's the only thing you have under your control,
yeah,
right? If you can build something that does end up being useful for society, great.
yeah,
But at the end of the day, you don't have that much control over it.
yeah,
You can keep trying, sure, but you can spend your whole life trying and nothing works. But all I know is day to day, I just love math now and
yeah,
physics, and I want to spend as much time as possible doing that. I want it to be useful. And for example, material science is one of the most useful parts of physics. So I got more drawn towards that as opposed to things like astrophysics, which
yeah.
is interesting. But if you study black holes, a little bit less applicable to our life 10 years from now,
Yeah,
right? As
yeah,
opposed
yeah.
to studying computers, right? But you know, I got really interested in this sort of biophysics, active matter, soft matter stuff because I'm interested in a lot of things, and one problem I have is exactly this: focusing on one thing, right? But I
Mm,
found this field that literally connects everything I ever studied, right? So I had biology, gave up on it, but I still love it
yeah,
in the back of my mind. It showed up again in biophysics. I like math. Physics is great. I like fluids and all this stuff, right?
yeah,
Robotics is related to this, colloidal robots, right? And control theory, also there.
yeah,
Everything somehow showed up in this little field that I didn't know about until not too long ago. And I'm like, dude, this is why everything looks like a straight line to me, right?
yeah.
Everything came to this moment.
I don't, man. I want to go deeper on this straight line thing because
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, I take a completely different path in my life compared to yours, like, but I feel the same way. And a lot of times, people come to me and like, man, did you calculate all this stuff and where you're? I'm like, no, I have no clue. But somehow everything's still related because I care about certain things.
Uh-huh.
And if I do something, for me, it's very important that I get good at it
Uh-huh.
in my own metric kind of thing. And that just means
Absolutely.
I care, like just care about something. Like same with the podcast, same with the way we do business, same with the way I treat my family. Like
Mhm.
everything comes down, and then suddenly you see that line, I guess. But like, how would you kind of help people to figure out that line in their life? Because in the end, I feel like regardless of doing physics, biology, like it doesn't matter what you do.
Mhm.
But that sounds like happiness to me. Like this kind of
Sure.
line that you're describing. I want to go a little bit more into that path of you. Like, how would help people to figure out that line in their life?
Sure. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's a great question. Um, so Robert Greene, right?
nice.
He had this awesome talk about how there's this really faint voice in your head that tells you what you actually want to do, and a lot of time it gets drowned out because you get influenced by other people,
Yeah,
right? Uh, so, for example, I still am really interested in startups, but I have to admit I was heavily influenced by the place I grew up in, the place I went to school, all these friends starting companies, right? So I got pulled in that direction, but I think at the end of the day, I'm a really academic person, right? I do want to see useful stuff come out of what I study and research, right?
yeah,
But I'm really into abstract things, right? And not a lot of people are,
yeah,
right? But I can feel the difference when I'm working on this kind of stuff versus
yeah,
I'm grinding on something, right? And look, at Mujin, for example, uh, we built amazing things that are really, really useful for other people, right? And there's a certain sense of accomplishment from that, right? But for example, I'm a pretty different person from the CTO, for example, of Mujin. So we're good friends, but he is a lot more on the practical side of things,
yeah, yeah,
and he just loves what he does, right? You know, every single moment where there's a lull, lunch break, anything, robots. We're just talking about robots all the time, right? I admire it, right? Uh, so I couldn't do that about robots. I still think they're interesting, but it's not the number one thing for me,
yeah,
right? But I could talk about math and physics and liquid crystals all day,
yeah,
right? So I didn't think that about myself because I'm like, oh, but I should
yeah,
like robots, or I should be into business, or whatever it is, right? And it's different for each person. But for me, that little voice is was there. It didn't
yeah,
get completely destroyed, right?
yeah.
And now I'm pursuing that.
And you're pursuing it since pretty much, I guess, last year when you quit your
Yeah,
previous
about a year ago.
startups.
Yeah,
And that's the thing, like, again, I'm trying to. A lot of things that you say, even though we have different backgrounds, sound very familiar because I start to realize more and more about what I want to do since I took a bit of time to not do anything really, like quitting my
exactly.
job and like being in that situation where it's like, okay, what do we do next? I don't know, just stuff that I enjoy doing and just get good at it and find a way to make a living out of it.
Yeah,
That's it,
exactly. Yeah,
and that's it, right? Like,
that's funny because I got a good friend in LA who periodically he'll just go into the Mojave Desert and
nice,
just rent some random cabin there
yeah,
for a week and just sit there,
yeah,
nothing. And he's like, every time you just like center yourself and you figure something
yeah,
out about yourself and what you want to do. And yeah, that's one way to do it.
yeah,
For me, it was a more in-your-face kind of experience because, okay, when I was doing this last startup, of course I'm working 7 days a week, right? And yeah, I was having fun. I like what I was doing, but it wasn't like exactly the thing I
Yeah.
wanted to do. Like something didn't feel quite right. But I would spend a lot of my free time,
Yeah.
right? Late at night, that kind of thing. Just reading stuff on physics,
Yeah.
doing physics problems, right? Just solving thousands of physics problems. I'm not taking a class or anything.
Yeah.
I just can't. I see this physics problem. I just have to solve it. I can't sleep, right? And then I just kind of subconsciously doing this,
Yeah.
right? Like, again, 2 a.m. on a Sunday night or something, right? And after a couple of years, I'm like, okay, it's pretty clear what I should be working on.
Yeah.
Okay, let me just spend all my time on this, right?
Yeah, and I think that's your thing, right? When you become obsessed by something because you're like, man, this is really what I want to do. I feel like a lot of times your environment is gonna tell you like, hey man, don't be obsessed, it's all in the balance. And you're like, but I love this. This is what I want to do. Because I have a lot of times when people are like, man, Axel, like, you're a workaholic, all you do is work. I'm like, yeah, but
It's
I
fun.
I choose to work on Saturdays and
Yeah,
Sundays. That's what I want to do.
yeah,
And I feel like that's a lot of times as well where people want you to go a certain direction, and that's why a lot of people don't find
mhm,
that excitement and that thing because it's like, hey man, let me be obsessed with something
mhm.
because in the end, you have to do something anyway.
No, that's a really good point because I have some friends who just say, some people just don't have that.
Yeah,
And it's like, well, I'm one of those people. I'm there to work, and I can find a job I like, maybe don't love, but I like it, and I'm doing that just to generate income or stability so I can go fishing or whatever it is. I'm
yeah,
like, okay, I don't believe that, right? I just don't believe it. There's got to be something for everybody
yeah,
where you just are obsessed with it. I think humans are just built that way.
yeah. I think the people who say I'm not that kind of person who get obsessed, it's just you kind of just accept quickly the mental barriers and like you listen to those voices as well, right?
Yeah,
And like I've every time people ask me as well for me, like right now, hey, how is the startup? How is this? I'm like, man, I'm just where I'm supposed to be.
yeah,
That's all I care about. Like, because I always had issues to fit in. Because I was always like, man, let me be obsessed with something.
yeah,
I feel like that's the way I feel healthy.
yeah,
So yeah, it resonates, and I can imagine for you with the type of researches you do, and a lot of people must look at it like, man, this is crazy stuff. Like,
sure,
Russ, don't hurt yourself. Like,
sure,
you can do
yeah,
so much more. You can make so much more money and do this and that.
absolutely,
And now you're going for a PhD. It's like,
yeah. Financially, a terrible decision,
yeah,
but I look at it this way. I mean, even if you don't care about like success in the traditional sense,
yeah,
if you do care about that,
yeah,
the only way to achieve that is to do something you really really like.
yeah.
Because you're not going to be somebody who loves what they're doing if you don't also love it,
True.
right? Like you can just decide, hey, I'm gonna be an NBA player or whatever, right? You might be really tall, might be really athletic,
Yeah,
whatever, but the guy who loves basketball and just spends every like waking moment thinking about basketball, practicing, they're gonna beat you.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Even if they don't beat you, they might not feel as fulfilled with
Uh-huh.
it, and like,
Yeah,
because that's the other thing, right? Like, I feel like, especially for me, like living in Japan, not speaking Japanese, I know that my life will be probably a lot easier somewhere else. But I take so much more fun being here, going through those challenges and like figuring
yeah,
things out. I'm like, man, it doesn't really matter if I'm in the optimum position here. That's not
yeah.
really the point. Just am I actually enjoying the journey and the challenges on a daily
Mhm.
basis? And like that's the way I look at it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really hard to tell like what optimum means, right?
Yeah.
Like, sure, yeah, I could go to the U.S. It's a bigger economy. There's more venture funding, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that 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 doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to get a 30% boost in my life, right?
Yeah.
Like you imagine you're in this ocean and the tide is bigger over there,
Yeah.
taller over there. So, oh, I should go over there, right? Maybe not.
Yeah.
Maybe you go over there. You don't know what's going to happen. There's contingencies, and you might just do a lot worse than you would have done
Yeah.
here. You don't know.
Yeah. I guess it all comes down to like what metric do you want to
Yeah,
judge
yeah,
your happiness on, right? Because yeah, no, man, this is super interesting. Like, what's for you? What is the definition of success right now in your current, situation? Then, because you're going to that path where it's like, I feel like it's very hard to define success in your situation. Like, but what will be success? What is successful Russ in 5 years gonna look like
Sure.
from here on?
I'll give you two answers here.
Yeah.
So one is kind of more like in my control answer, which is if I can just spend most of my time thinking about this stuff, this physics stuff, math stuff, and not have to worry about getting money from some other place. Right?
Yeah.
If I can turn this into a full-time thing, and I mean, look, I can turn it into a full-time thing, but I don't want to ideally sacrifice things financially, right? And you know, some people, a lot of scientists take a purist route. They're like, it doesn't matter how poor you are. Like, if you love this, like,
Right.
you're in this, right? I love physics that much. I could do that.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean it has to be that way,
Yeah.
right? I don't hate money, right?
Yeah.
It would be great to use that somehow to have a fulfilling and, you know, fulfilling life with some wealth and have money for my family, all that stuff, right? So if I could do that, that's happiness and success for me. But the more ambitious answer is this. So I really admire past physicists who completely changed the paradigm of physics or science, right? So when you build some amazing product like the iPhone, for example, you know, the concept of having this device that's wireless and having wireless communications, as a broad concept, that's amazing. The iPhone is a specific manifestation of that. There's going to be something that replaces that one day. Right? It's so embedded in our lives that we feel like it's going to be here forever. But look, 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, it's not going to be around, right? So it will just be a footnote in history. Maybe it was a stepping stone that was very important, but it's going to be obsolete one day. And you could imagine an alternate universe where, you know, maybe Google Pixel was the dominant phone, right? Maybe that would have been a worse universe. I don't know, or better, right? It depends on how much you like Android versus iPhone. But it's just a blip in history at the end of the day, right? There's going to be some more advanced technology that we're going to get to, and whether we took the Android route or the iPhone route, it doesn't really matter. But when you discover Newton's laws of motion, or Maxwell's equations, or relativity, or whatever, I mean, that is just, the world is never the same.
That's a massive
Yeah, that's just, and most importantly, it's true forever, right? I can spend all this time optimizing the iPhone or developing some algorithm that, you know, serves page requests faster or something, right? And that will be very important for immediate society during that year, those 10 years. But if I find something like relativity, right? Even if everybody dies, right? That's just some truth you know about the universe that's just there forever, right? And that's, even if nobody's there to praise you for it, it's like, I looked behind the door and I saw something. I can die in peace now, you know?
Yeah, you had an impact.
Yeah.
Because that's the whole thing, right?
Yeah. Or even if it didn't have an impact, just you were able to use your mind and understand something that no one has understood before, right? Like you discovered some secret. Yeah.
I want to go on like a few hot takes that you know you did send to us, and one of them was like, people wonder if AI will perfectly mimic humans. Of course it will one day, but that doesn't mean AI is smart. It just means people aren't that special.
Yes, dude, I love this topic. So let me start by starting with an argument called the Chinese room argument, right? So there's this philosopher called John Searle, this famous guy at Berkeley. So this is back in the 80s, but he said, imagine we have this room, and on one side there's a little window, and you put in a slip of paper. So let's say somebody writes some Chinese on it, and you don't know any Chinese. So you just write it up on the paper, you put it in, and on the other side there's another window, and a slip of paper comes out in English, and it's perfectly translated. So you can't go inside the room. You don't know what's inside the room. Maybe somebody's in there, maybe somebody's not. It's a black box. So if I put in any other Chinese phrase, I can test this as many times as I want. It always gives me perfect English. It's perfect program almost, right? So does that room itself understand Chinese, or is it just an algorithm? Right? Now, Searle, what he's saying in that argument is, obviously it doesn't understand Chinese, right? Now, maybe there's somebody in the room who's following instructions, and there's some books there and some papers or whatever, and maybe it's a complicated algorithm, but as long as he follows the steps, he can produce the perfect output and give it to you, right? Maybe that person doesn't know any Chinese. Maybe some Chinese person wrote the algorithm, right? But the room itself as an entity, most people would say it doesn't understand Chinese. And obviously the random guy in there doing the calculations doesn't know Chinese, right? So he says that's what AI is like, right? So the AI itself is the room and it doesn't understand anything. It's just an algorithm following certain steps. And it may produce perfect output, right? But that doesn't mean it has actual understanding, right? So that's the difference between syntax. It produces the perfect syntax, but semantically it doesn't know what's going on. And that he's saying that that's a fundamental distinction between really, really good AI, maybe you can't really tell the difference, and people. I draw a very different conclusion from that. So his argument, I think, is totally valid. But I think we are also that room. Okay. So if you go to ChatGPT and you type in stuff, that's a classic example of a Chinese room, right? I don't believe that ChatGPT understands anything.
Right.
It's looking at very sophisticated patterns. Some very smart engineers developed this thing, right?
Yeah.
They didn't explicitly program it. I get that. But it's all statistics, right? It's giving you a pattern.
It's a bunch of data basically
Yeah.
crunched. And
Exactly, right? And then, it can get things wrong, and it doesn't even know that it's wrong, right?
yeah.
But I think you and I are the same thing. Okay?
Yeah.
Here's how. When you're thinking in your mind, there's a part of you that talks and a part of you that listens. Now, some people, they might see pictures or hear things or smell things, right? But, just to make the argument simple, let's say you talk in your head. That's how you think.
Yeah.
So, you're thinking about what you should get for dinner or something today, right?
Yeah.
You think in your head, you say a word. There's another person inside of you that's listening, responding, and you have this conversation. So which one of those is you? Is both of those things you? So I think there's one part of you that's posing the question, what should I have for dinner today? And the other person is processing that, thinking,
Yeah.
and then sending a response. So that second person is almost like a Chinese room.
Yeah.
You don't know how you're thinking. It just appears to be a conversation inside your head,
Yeah.
but that's just putting the problem back one step. Right?
Yeah.
So if you explain how you understand that a certain phrase is grammatically correct, right? Maybe you're trained in grammar or something, so you can kind of give a better argument. But a lot of the time, native speakers, when they are given a sentence, they just say, "Oh, it feels right," or "It sounds right."
Yeah.
So you don't even know how your internal process is working, right? So in that sense, I think we're not even sentient, really, right? We don't know how we are processing information.
Right.
But if you believe at the end of the day that our body is just made out of atoms, then I think you have no choice but to accept that you are just an algorithm, right? So you could be wrong about stuff, just like ChatGPT is wrong about stuff. And, of course, people who listen to this, they'll be like, look, there's an obvious objection here, right? You can understand things, right?
Yeah.
You can learn to not put your hand in a fire, for example, right, from experience. You can imagine the consequences of that. I say you could program a computer to do the same thing.
Yeah.
Right? So there's something called duck typing in computer science, right? So the argument, duck typing. So how it goes is, if it quacks like a duck, if it makes sounds like a duck, if it acts like a duck, it's a duck. And so what this means is, if you create some sort of object in a program that matches all the functions of what you expect, then it doesn't matter what's actually inside of that thing, right? So if I have a chatbot and it behaves like a person, acts like a person, it doesn't matter what's behind the screen, right? So the philosophers would say, well, that's a clear difference from actual people, because, of course, if I cut open a program, it's not a duck, right?
Mm.
Duh. But you could keep programming something
Yeah.
to have more and more functions until no matter which question you ask, it still acts like a human, right?
Yeah.
Because if you say that you understand something, like let's say you claim you understand calculus,
Yeah.
right? So what do I do? How do I check that?
Yeah.
I give you calculus problems, right? Or you claim you know English or whatever. What do? I sit here and I ask you questions in English, right? But how do you know that you know calculus or English? Again, there's that voice in your head that
Yeah.
talks to the other guy, and there's a black box, sends a response, right?
Yeah.
It's no different. You're
Yeah.
also a statistical machine,
Yeah.
and you're just ChatGPT, right? You're more sophisticated than ChatGPT, but it's a level of degree. It's not some magic moment like AGI suddenly appears and we're like humans now, right? No, it's just
Yeah.
a gradual transition, I think.
I agree, man. In a sense that like, so for me, there's like clearly two phases in my life. The moment where I feel very, very bad while being in my home country because I dropped out and
Sure.
there's like no real future and stuff. And then there's like phase where I'm going abroad and I start realizing like, wait a minute, I'm actually a lucky, very lazy person, nothing else. And
Sure.
it's time to move on. And like, so it takes this whole rewinding thing. And then for a long time and still now, I remember how I used to think and how I think now. And it's like completely different thing, right? It's like, okay, everything I thought to be true until then now suddenly changes. Now learning so much from YouTube, I can always compare because I'm someone who writes a lot of stuff. So I tend to write what I want to achieve, what I believe on certain things, and I kind of compare it, and I can see things keep changing faster and faster, moving faster and faster. And I feel like it's the same thing, right? It's like you just add data to something,
Mm-hmm.
you react differently to something, but in the end,
Right.
there's no real like, there's nothing else than just data. Like even for you, like you said, like you grow up, Silicon Valley, you're completing that startup mindset, and suddenly you believe, oh, this is the right path,
Mm-hmm.
and you step away from it. Oh, actually, maybe not. In the end, you're just a product from your environment, nothing else, right?
Yeah, I do
That's
believe
it.
that.
Yeah.
That's maybe kind of nihilistic, but I don't have strong evidence for it, but I really believe it's true because uh, when people claim that they understand something,
Mm.
I think that's actually just an emotion.
Yeah.
Nobody understands anything, right?
Yeah.
So, for example, I've sometimes I tutor students in high school or college just kind of for fun, and this happens all the time in math, right?
Mm.
I'll I'll teach them a certain equation, right? And math is very unintuitive, right?
Yeah.
But you start to feel like you develop a sort of feeling or intuition for math, right? And then I'll pose some tough problem, and they'll kind of struggle through it, and suddenly they're like, "Aha, I got it,"
Yeah.
and it's completely wrong, their answer, right? And I'm like, "You don't got anything, man. Like,
Yeah.
it's just an emotion,
Yeah.
and I could explain the right answer to you, and you're just gonna keep looking at that answer over and over again until you feel an emotion,
Yeah. Yeah. It's
right?
repetition, right? Like
Right.
you, you just don't feel intimidated anymore about a problem at some
Sure.
point, right? Because you
Sure.
keep doing it. Yeah. Again, I can compare the emotions that I had before starting a company here in Japan and the feelings that I have now. And I'm like, wait a minute, this is the same person.
Hmm.
Just talk to a few people, convinced myself that I can do this.
Yeah.
And now wait, it's possible. Like
Different
I got
emotions.
it. And
Yeah.
then like the next problem comes up like, damn it, this is the first
Yeah.
time I see this problem.
Yeah.
And it's just repetition, like accepting that like, okay, it takes a while to not feel intimidated anymore. Then there's like that emotion that you're like, okay, it's not scary anymore at least.
Yeah.
Oh,
It
I
starts to
got it.
recognize a pattern,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah,
And then you can apply the pattern to more situations.
yeah.
That doesn't mean you understand anything. Right?
Yeah, no,
It's
exactly.
like ChatGPT again,
Yeah,
applying patterns to things.
yeah.
Humans are just better at it.
I think that's the thing, right? Like being humble and curious, that should be
Hmm.
kind of the hack to just feel
Yeah.
fulfilled in life, right? Humble and curious and just like
Sure.
keep walking forward, I guess. And whatever forward means anyway, right?
Right.
Because I feel
Right.
like in the end it's just, I mean, yeah, whatever direction people call it, like,
Yeah. And even that, we have the sense of we have free will,
yeah.
right? And I think we cannot help but feel that. Even if you believe you don't have any free will and you're just being tossed around by your environment, even if that's true, which I believe, you can never experience life that way. You have to experience it as if you're making all the decisions, calling all the shots. And
Mm.
again, I think that's just an emotion. So, people are afraid or maybe excited about AI becoming AGI one day, right?
Yeah.
Uh, I think there is no hard line there.
Yeah.
And what's going to make AI feel like human intelligence
Yeah.
is actually not making the algorithm smarter or the math smarter. It's already smart, right? The missing ingredient is actually emotion,
Yeah.
because all we're doing is just fooling ourselves into feeling a certain way, right? If you talk to the chatbot and you say something rude and it gets pissed off at you, that's going to feel a lot more human than that chatbot answering some crazy math question,
Yeah.
right? Of course, it can answer the math question, but what we're waiting for is, can it think for itself?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I think we can't think for ourselves either, right? But we act in a certain emotional way that makes me feel like you're an independent entity, you have free will, etc.
Yeah.
I feel those emotions. I feel I have free will. They're just emotions. But if you
Yeah.
program emotions explicitly into a computer, I don't know if that's a good idea or not. But if you
Yeah.
did that, that would feel like AGI.
Like, do you feel like it will benefit the world that everyone is super enthusiastic about AI right now? Do you feel like
Yeah,
where
good
do you
point.
like? I'm okay. I'm very kind of, I guess, biased on this one because I'm super enthusiastic because
Sure.
I felt like until now people like me who don't have a computer science degree, well, we're kind of left on the side a little bit.
Hmm.
Oh, I'm not a techie guy. I'm not this.
Sure.
I'm not that. And now it's like, well, guys, I know how to prompt. Guess what? I checked a YouTube video. I get it. And so I feel
Yeah.
like, wait a minute, this is great. Like
Yeah.
I get a second chance to really be part of this
Yeah.
this game, right? But then I also understand that people who studied it for years, who I guess are part of building this current situation up, they feel a bit like, hey, this guy was not supposed to be at our table, but he is.
Uh,
And so I feel like often when I talk to engineers and stuff, man, like
Pretty skeptical about it.
they're very, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And I'm like, wait, but in the end, isn't the person that asks the best questions,
Hmm.
isn't that person gonna win, right? Like,
Sure. Yeah. By the way, I do some AI stuff in my own research because I'm using, for example, reinforcement learning to try to control these liquid crystals in simulation. So I'm in this AI stuff,
yeah,
right? I'm not doing chatbot stuff, but I've been studying it and using it for a while. But I think I can see a lot of limitations of it. I think one day, in the far future, we can basically simulate everything, including people, right? Because if you believe we're made out of atoms, we don't have any special soul or whatever, then of course you can build them out of other atoms eventually, right? I don't think it's going to happen in 20 or 30 years. I think it's going to be hundreds or thousands of years, at least. But talking about the short to midterm, AI, whether we like it or not, it's going to have a big impact. It's going to get a lot more powerful, right? I don't think it's going to be like a Skynet Terminator situation anytime soon.
yeah,
Maybe one day, right? But it's not right around the corner, right? Because again, this kind of goes back to emotions. People think it's advancing really fast
yeah,
because it mimics human behavior. But we look at a chatbot and it looks like, oh, this thing is so smart.
yeah,
It's not. We're just easily fooled, right?
yeah,
When we see things that act human, we suddenly apply this like weird magical quality to it. So I've seen this with robots, right? If you look at a robotic arm, it looks like it's alive. And when people see it for the first time, it's kind of freaky. But it's no more advanced in terms of hardware than a car. A car might be more complicated actually, but we don't think about cars taking over the world, right?
mhm,
It's the same level of technology, really, right? But as soon as you put it in a human form and you start using adjectives, saying like, "Oh, it's reasoning," or "It's thinking,"
mhm,
then we start getting scared, right? And like I said, I think there's no real distinction between us and them, but
mhm.
we're very far from crossing that line, I think.
Yeah, yeah, it's tricky. If you feel special, you're not really opening your eyes on a lot of things,
Mhm.
right? Like, yeah. What do you think about what does life mean to you, Ross? What's
Sure.
living and non-living?
So I got again, kind of a nihilistic viewpoint, but I think it's empowering. We're just a bag of atoms at the end of the day, right? That doesn't take away agency from us. I think that's very empowering because it means we can solve human problems, right? It's not some mystical thing, right? And I think that's not a uncommon viewpoint these days. Everybody's inundated with science, but I think people don't really go all the way in terms of what that implies, right? Of course, when you go to the doctor, you're treating your body as if it's just a bag of cells and molecules, right? You accept the doctor's medication, right? You believe it's going to work, right? That belief is only rational if you believe your body is just matter, right? But then when we talk to each other or we talk about AI, right? Suddenly we act as if people have souls, right? We treat people as if they have souls. We should. I'm not saying people should do immoral stuff, right? But at the end of the day, we are just interactions between molecules and atoms. So to get to your point there, I think there's no real distinction between non-living stuff and people, living things, right? This table, right? It's passive. So in the physics sense, we think of it as passive because you do something to it, you push it, you heat it up, and it just kind of lets go of all the energy, right? It'll change form, right? But it doesn't fight back really, right?
Mm.
Or it doesn't convert the energy into some kind of movement. So if we have coffee, for example, and we leave it in a room that's kind of cold, we know that the coffee is going to cool down and we can predict the rate, etc. So in that sense, the coffee is passive. But living things, they're in what we call non-equilibrium. So they always maintain a certain temperature. Well, not all things, but people, for example. Mammals, we maintain a body temperature higher than the environment typically, right? Uh, and if we go into a cold environment, we still have that temperature in us, and we're burning energy, food, to maintain that temperature. We're fighting off
Mm.
the temperature gradient there. And if we go to a hot environment, our body keeps us again at the same temperature. We sweat, etc. Right? So it's an active system. But besides that little difference, there's no real distinction between non-living and living. So in biology, if you go down to the level of bacteria and viruses, there's a blurry line there, right? So biologists consider bacteria to be alive, but I don't know if most people would consider them to be alive. Maybe, right? But they're not alive in the same sense that we're alive, obviously, right? We can
Mm.
think a lot more than they do, but I think again, I might be wrong about this, but I think the layman's perception of living versus non-living is maybe viruses are at the line, right? So would you consider viruses to be alive, like COVID, for example? What do you think? It's just your opinion.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'll say so.
right. A lot of biologists would say no. Some might say yes, right? So viruses, they need a host cell to replicate. They got to go into your cells. They hijack the cells, the machinery, make copies of themselves, and go out into the world. Okay, so it seems, in a sense, that they're alive,
Mm.
right? Because they're replicating. Okay, but there are inanimate objects that also do that, right? You can get tiny molecules that
Mm.
coagulate and make copies of themselves, and they're not smart in the sense of they can't hijack cells, for example. They're not that sophisticated. Um, but a lot of biologists consider viruses to not be alive because they cannot function unless they hijack the bacteria. They cannot just
Mm.
take in food and duplicate on their own, right?
Mm.
But
What
they're
would be the difference then with a human being? Like,
exactly. So
mm.
there is no real difference. It's just degrees, right?
Yeah.
So you can go to bacteria, to plants, to dogs, to people, and the difference is just in the sophistication
Mm.
of that non-equilibrium aspect, right?
Mm.
So a bacteria can sense light, right? And it goes towards the light because it realizes there's probably food there, something like that, right? And it's going to survive a lot better than just a sack of fat, for example, like a droplet of fat. That thing's not going to move, right? Or it's going to move randomly. A bacteria is just one step above that. It has a little bit of directed motion. And because of that, it's going to last a little bit longer.
Mm.
Okay. But you look at a dog, it responds to stimuli that thinks it's going to keep it alive. And there's some other random bugs in there in terms of, you uh, scratch its back and it acts a certain way, right? But for the most part, all the little behaviors are a result of evolution. And, for the most part, it's there to keep the dog alive.
Yeah.
We're one step above that, right? But a lot of our behavior is determined by uh,
How
quest
are
for
we one
food, right?
step above that? Like,
Yeah. So because we don't just go towards food, right? We
right.
just walk towards it, right? We think about other people because we think, hey, these other people are going to keep me alive. How can I have a higher social status,
Mm.
right? How can I organize these other people to do things for me,
Yeah.
or to love me, or to stay away from me, right? I think of threats from other people or opportunities from other people, right? And even if you're just hanging out playing video games with your friend, right?
Mm.
There's a certain biological function that is being done there, right? If you're completely alone, sitting in solitary confinement, I mean, people die because of that, right? There's like a mental thing that happens. But if you hang out with friends, right, be around people you love, there's many studies showing that this will actually make your lifespan longer.
Yeah.
There must be a mechanism for that. I mean, like a molecular mechanism. I think it's too complicated for us to understand right now,
Yeah.
but there must be something there. Uh, so in that way, we're fighting equilibrium as well, but we're doing it not just in terms of a dumb bacteria approaching light.
Yeah.
We're thinking 100 steps in the future. If I go and get this PhD, is this going to lead to happiness through this really roundabout route, right?
Mm.
And maybe it's just an accident of evolution that we have this really roundabout way of
Yeah.
achieving things. But I think, simply put, a big part of this is just we have a lot of food these days, so
Yeah.
we don't need to think about things on that simple level.
Yeah. Yeah. We're allowed to think on other things because that problem kind of got solved. And
Yeah, the Maslow's hierarchy of
why do you
needs, right?
feel like it's empowering? Like you mentioned, this is, it's very scary for most people, but if you really look at it, it's empowering. Like
Right.
it's freeing us. So like, why do you feel
Yeah,
that way?
this viewpoint, yeah, that there's no real distinction between non-living and living.
Mm.
I do think it's empowering because it means you can modify and change the body, right? Because if humans are something special that cannot be replicated by computers or even synthetic cells or other biological things, if we're something special, then we cannot be engineered or studied, right? And you know, uh, the viewpoint of a lot of religions is this. I get it, right? We want to feel special, but if we do that, there's a barrier now. There are some questions that cannot be answered,
Mm.
right? And of course, science cannot answer all questions either. But when it comes to medical problems or enhancements to the human body, if we take the viewpoint that we are just molecules,
Yeah.
we can rearrange things.
Yeah.
There's a reason for everything,
Yeah. And everyone
right?
becomes curious about it as well, right?
Yeah.
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 Yeah, I mean, this whole, I guess, longevity and stuff, like, what's his name? David Sinclair, like,
Uh-huh.
I read a lot of those things myself, again, because I became a father. I want to be around with my kid and I want to stay fit and
Sure.
the whole blue zone stuff as well, and that's it, right? You at some
Mm.
point just say, well, let's see what the environment does to the body
Mm.
and what the food does and stuff like, yeah, yeah, it's interesting, man. What
Uh-huh.
Like, what are your personal, I guess, beliefs when it comes to like, will is AI a good thing long term? Like,
Mm.
because beside what we just talked about, for example, is humanity ready to accept that they're not special? We're not special, and so we're not. There's not real like intelligence. There's this black box. Like, what if we cannot get past that obstacle? Is AI
Yeah.
still a good thing then? Is humanity ready for
Uh-huh.
it right now? In that sense, yeah.
Yeah. Honestly, I think it it doesn't matter if we're ready or not because it's here and it's happening. It's coming. We gotta learn how to deal with it. I
Mm.
think if we accept that we're nothing special, we can deal with AI without so much hype, right? Because a lot of the press on AI is for human-like behaviors, like chat, that kind of thing, or producing images that can please us, basically. But if we use AI for science or industry, that kind of thing, uh, in a way, that's actually kind of lower-hanging fruit and maybe more immediately useful for us,
Mm.
right? So if we kind of get over this, I guess, ego trip that we're something special. Of course, in some ways we are special, right?
Yeah.
We're the smartest animal, right? But what I mean is, in terms of physical and chemical laws, we're subject to the same laws that every other atom, every other cell, whatever, is subject to, right? Then we can look at AI in a more cool-headed, rational way, and we can make more useful progress, right?
Mm.
And yeah, again, a lot of people are afraid of it's going to take over or whatever. Maybe. I'm pretty skeptical about that because it's got to have emotion, and it could have emotion, of course, because we have emotion, right? But I think we're just so far from that
Mm.
that I'm glad some people are thinking about that.
Well,
Right?
what's an emotion then in all of this? Like, because again, if we agree that an emotion is the fact that at some point you're not intimidated anymore about something, and like you kind of react, you're not scared about something anymore now. Like you're feeling happy, anxious, whatever. Like,
Sure.
why could an AI not have that after it's seen so many simulations, so much data? Like, why can it not get there and have emotions?
So this is more of a belief of mine, but I think that's not going to spontaneously arise unless it's explicitly programmed.
Right.
Um, so that said, somehow in our arrangement of molecules, that
Yeah.
phenomenon showed up. I think it might not be possible with silicon, but maybe other materials. I don't know. This is getting really speculative. Um, I just don't think it's going to happen anytime soon,
Mm.
unless we completely redesign the way that computers are created,
Do you
right?
think
But
we might see like the let's say universal income and like the fact that there's no more jobs and now nobody really has to do
that's very
anything?
interesting. So
Like, do you think we can get there in our lifetimes?
that's a human problem, I think. I think no matter how much progress we make, there's going to be people without jobs and exploitation and all this stuff, right? We have enough resources, right? I think they're just not distributed in a proper way. And yes, there are certain parts of the world where they don't have enough resources, right? But technology is often not the bottleneck for those things. But technology is always sitting in this fabric of the economy and society, right? And again, unless AI gets a mind of its own and starts having its own emotions, own motivations, and destroying everything, except for that crazy scenario,
Mm.
somebody owns the AI. Somebody can use it for so and so, right? And that controls the flow of resources. And no matter how much extra advantage we get from technology,
Mm.
other things are determining the distribution of that, right?
Yeah.
We can find a cure for cancer. That doesn't mean every single person in the world is going to get that, right?
Can you imagine an AI being like a government AI, for example, where we get to that point?
Yeah, that would be super interesting. That makes a lot of sense, right? To put that in place. Again, there's a lot of potential for misuse there,
Yeah.
and at the end of the day, some person is going to be controlling that. I think,
How
right?
about like
Uh,
blockchain, decentralizing the
yeah, but even that, there's some people in the link somehow.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
we're already there anyway now,
yeah,
right? Like, I
yeah,
was looking into some YouTube documentary about BlackRock and like just
sure.
how everything really, really works, and there's only three really playing around. Like, it's
Uh-huh.
insane. We're already there, right? It's just
Yeah.
that one central AI is already there, so to speak. Anyway.
Yeah, I guess it's how much do we decide to give up power completely to that AI, right?
Yeah.
If they really are calling all the shots,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
that sounds very dangerous. But then you remove people from the link, I guess. But
Yeah.
yeah, that gets into some interesting stuff because would you want to live in a government like that?
Yeah.
Maybe some people would.
Yeah.
Maybe some people.
Yeah,
Maybe
because
yeah,
I am closer to what you say as well about the fact that I'm like, we're not that special,
sure,
so we might as well crunch all the data and get the mean outcome of it
sure,
anyway, because so far I don't trust more an AI
sure.
or this. And so this is a conversation I often have with one or close friends of mine. Like,
Uh-huh.
yeah, I will absolutely go for an AI run government.
Sure.
Absolutely. I mean, maybe not
Yeah.
right now,
Yeah.
but once
Yeah.
you know,
Eventually.
yeah,
Yeah. Maybe.
yeah,
Yeah. I'm very ambivalent about all this because yeah, I don't want to come across as a reductionist. I guess deep down I am. We're all just atoms, right? But that doesn't mean that everything should be analyzed from that really low level,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
Give an example, right? You go watch a movie. I could analyze every single pixel value on the screen, and
yeah.
from there try to put together the story of the movie. It's
Mm,
not a very good way to go about doing that, right?
mm,
what I should do is recognize the faces on the screen,
Mm.
hear the sentences being said, right, and piece together the story, learn about what the director was thinking of, right? That's the level of detail that you should have when you're analyzing a film, right?
Yeah.
But if you put that into AI, right now AI is modeling that from the level of pixels. Of
Mm-hmm.
course, there's some correspondence between, whether this pixel is 255 versus 250. Of course, there's a correspondence between that and what's being presented on the screen. But that's just unnecessary info for the most part, right? We've developed minds that average out or filter out all that unnecessary information and just give us the highlights, right? We see
Yeah.
outlines of faces, right?
Yeah.
So, uh, I'm not trying to say we shouldn't care about things like social science, humanities, and all this stuff. It's very important.
Yeah.
That's a different level of analysis. But I do believe deep down there's some link.
Yeah.
Everything has some link with molecules and atoms, right? Of course, I'm biased. That's what I do all day. So, of course, I'm going to think that.
Yeah.
But I think all of us, because we accept science and medicine, that kind of stuff, deep down, we really do believe that as well, even if we don't want to admit it.
Yeah, and like to me it does resonate a lot because I had to kind of reinvent myself a lot, and being surrounded by people that I didn't feel comfortable with in the beginning, I had to kind of be like, man, I'm not that special, like let's just rebuild and look at those people like and say, okay, what did they do that I didn't do so far? And like, so I've been through that rebuilding process.
Sure.
And to that conclusion of like, you're not special, nothing will happen unless you accept that fact that you're not special.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it does resonate a lot with me, and I do believe at some point it gets very empowering as well, like because you also realize it's never really about you, and that becomes very powerful because you don't take shit personally as well. You
Sure.
don't get offended. You just see it as like, oh, it's just new information. I can learn from this.
Right.
So no, I don't feel like you're like putting it down or anything on that level, but like, yeah, it's interesting, man. It's super interesting. Where do you see beauty in life then, in general? Because one of the things that I've been struggling with for the past 7, 8 years, I guess, because I had this complex of like I didn't go to high school, and I was like, man, I need to educate myself very, very quickly. And there is such a thing as like too much information. And you kind of take the beauty away of things that people will enjoy looking at stuff. And like you say, you look at a movie and you're like analyzing what did the director think, but most people you surround yourself with are not going to be willing to go into that conversation with you.
Sure. Keep it surface level.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, man, give me a break. I'm trying to relax here, kind of thing.
Sure.
Right? How do you kind of find beauty in life? Because you seem to be someone who analyzes like crazy.
Yeah.
Right. Like how does that? How do you find kind of balance? Because it's all balanced in the end, right?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. I am most inspired by the creative process of people. So again, AI I think is pretty far from that, and that's again I think it's just a matter of degree. But at least for now, I'm still very inspired by people making up new things. Like it could be art, it could be science, it could be whatever. But I watch a great film or read a good book, and I just think, how did this person come up with this? Right? Like, of course, in some deep, some underlying deep sense, their experiences in their life came to this moment, right? But they still had to piece things together in just some crazy way to make this amazing thing. And it's like, what is going on in their head? And you can see that in art. You can see that in math and science. To a lot of people, it seems like you're like a robot and you sit there and you calculate things. That's not what it's like, because there's so many possibilities. You're not just crunching things. You're imagining physical properties and stuff, and then you're taking a guess. You're trying to verify the guess. So there's a lot of creative work involved there too, as well. And it's like, how do we find that needle in the haystack? Right, in terms of whether it's art or technical stuff.
Yeah, nah, I agree. Again, I'm with you on this. Like, I love reading biographies.
Yeah.
Same thing. I want to study the person and like understand how did we get there. Like, so biography is something I love to do.
Absolutely.
Russ, we could go forever, but like here's the thing: we do have a tradition on the podcast to do a rapid fire question.
Okay, let's do it.
So There are a couple of ones that are very easy to answer. Some other where we kind of want your, I guess, more wisdom.
Gotcha.
But first one, Osaka or Tokyo?
Tokyo for sure.
What do you like to do better when you relax? Gaming, reading, or watching TV?
Right now, gaming, but I do like movies a lot, so I'll go to the theater even now, and
Wow.
yeah,
Okay.
I'm really into films.
Which game?
I play fighting games a lot, but some adventure games like Zelda and that kind of thing.
Okay.
My favorite game is Fire Emblem because it's a strategy game. Right? It's like a super complicated version of chess, basically.
Okay.
But it's
You
again.
play chess?
I don't play chess much, but I like strategy games. So,
Nice. Yeah. Yeah. Age of Empire all the way, man.
yeah.
Played a lot. Yeah. And
Strategy
StarCraft,
games.
StarCraft
Yeah,
as well.
sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
If you could choose any time, present, past, or future, to be born, when and where would you be?
I want to say right now, to be honest, but that might just because I'm used to it. But right after World War II would have been super interesting, right? Because I feel like the curve of technology at that moment was just insane. And people talk about it now, how crazy it was. But again, I'm really interested in hardware.
Yeah.
And that moment right there, so much stuff was getting discovered. The transistor was getting invented then, nuclear weapons, all this crazy stuff. And really you started to see science become kind of spreading out into society at the point. And there's just something special about that moment in time. 50s, 60s,
Yeah. Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
What's your go-to karaoke song?
Forever by Drake.
Early bird or night owl?
Night owl, but I don't sleep that much in general.
Okay.
I like to get up and just do stuff.
I could have guessed that one.
Yeah.
Mountains or beach?
Mountains. I like snowboarding, so. Yeah.
A little bit deeper here. And what's the kindest thing someone has ever done to you?
Ooh. I gotta think about that one, but.
I didn't answer. It's a bit deeper, this one, huh?
Yeah. Okay. Let me think about this one.
Yeah.
So this may be a bit vague, but some people who kind of believed in me even though I wasn't showing promise or something like that. It could have been in school, it could have been at work, that kind of thing. But there have been a couple times. Hope you allow me to not go into specifics, but a couple times where people kind of took a chance on me, and whether it panned through or not, that belief in me and confidence just kept me going, right? And sometimes it's a really subtle gesture, just like a phrase or something, and the person might not even know that was that meaningful to me. They might have even forgot that conversation happened. But yeah, there's certain 3 or 4 times maybe in life where that happened, and it's like that set me on a certain path.
Yeah.
So random act of kindness.
Yeah. Got you. Yeah. And what's the best advice you ever received?
Okay, that's a good one. So, especially when you hear advice from older people, you should only listen to half of that. An older person said that to me, right? So he was giving me all this advice, and in the middle he stopped and he's like, "You should only listen to half of this because older people, they went on a certain path, and there's a lot of contingencies, right? Random things happened. It might not have been that way. You listen to some successful business person, and they're like, "Yeah, it was all me. I did everything, right? Yada yada yada, right?" But they don't admit or even recognize all these random things that happened, right? And it's not just about opportunities, but like just some random thing happened, like a certain client didn't pick up the phone that day, or they did, right? And that one little random decision made everything work, right? So of course there are lessons to draw from life experience, but it totally could have gone a different way, right? So when you hear advice from people, you got to synthesize that, and you're gonna hear some contradictions, so you can filter those out, and then you got to judge for yourself out of the remaining advice. Does that apply to my situation or not? And it might be impossible to know, but I thought that was great advice for synthesizing all
Yeah.
the other advice you're getting from all these different people.
Yeah. Yeah. Perfect. Yeah. Just one thing on that is like these days we receive a lot of advice and we try to just look at for confirmation in advice at this point.
Sure.
Whereas like, okay, we believe in something, and if the advice that people give kind of aligns with what we're doing, all right,
Sure.
we'll just go for that. And awesome, Ross, absolute pleasure, man. Yeah, we could probably keep going forever,
Yeah.
but that was an awesome chat.
Yeah.
Thank
Good
you.
talk.
Good talk, man. Thank you.
Yeah.
Cheers.